Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular shiur in halacha. In this case, the history of halacha. We're talking about the impact of the clock on Jewish practice in general. The specific example which we're using is Ma'ariv Bizmano, the correct time to daven Ma'ariv. What we saw last week was that from the beginning of rabbinic literature, it was standard practice in just about every community everywhere to daven Ma'ariv, Mincha and Ma'ariv together before sunset, and then the people would scurry home before it got dark. That's the way it was done since antiquity until fairly recently. And we saw plenty of evidence in many different kihilot, in many different geographical areas, in many different historical periods that they used to daven Mincha and Ma'ariv together before sunset. Now, this all began to change at a very specific point in time. Let's get that on the screen again. We looked last time, we didn't finish last time, but we began looking at the Shaloh HaKodesh, the Shnei Luchot HaBris. We introduced him last time at 17th century, and we saw that he's from Frankfurt in Germany, but he came here to live in Yerushalayim, and when he was in Yerushalayim, he wrote about what he remembered from Chutz La'aretz, what he remembered from the practice of the Jewish communities in Europe, in Poland, in Bohemia, what they used to call Bohemia, today it's called the Czech Republic, Kol Malchus Ashkenaz, throughout Ashkenaz territory, Noagim Litpalel Arvit Hen Oda Yom Gadol. In the 17th century, it was still common to daven Ma'ariv while it was still daylight. We saw a little bit of a controversy about how many hours before sunset you could daven Ma'ariv, but it was full daylight when they davened Ma'ariv. In any event, Chadashim Mikarov Ba'u. This is what we saw at the end of last week's shiur. A new practice has grown up. Something, an innovation in Jewish practice. Yesh Chavrusa Kedusha. There are some holy groups. Small numbers of Jews are gathering together to constitute a minyan of their own. Mitchabrim Litpalel Arvit B'Shachato. And these small groups here and there throughout Ashkenaz territory are performing their own small minyanim in order to daven Ma'ariv Bizmano at the correct time, well, what they think is the correct time, namely after the stars have come out. Now we know, based on all the sources, that there is an advantage to this. After all, although it is indeed possible, and all the poskim agree, and indeed all the rabbis through all the generation were in fact davening Ma'ariv while it was still full daylight, although that's universally agreed to be okay, nonetheless, Kriyat Shema, the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael, which is part of Ma'ariv, that must be at night. And the part of Kriyat Shema, which is part of Ma'ariv, the 3 paragraphs of Shema Yisrael, which are part of Ma'ariv, if you're davening before night, well, you haven't actually fulfilled the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael, and you have to repeat Shema Yisrael later at home. And it became the standard minhag, the standard practice, as we saw, the Kriyat Shema Al Hamitah, before going to sleep, people would recite the 3 paragraphs of Shema Yisrael just to make sure the mitzvah was done at night. Okay, so what happened in the 17th century? Be'ir ve'em b'Yisrael b'Prague, beginning in Prague, which was a major Jewish center until the Holocaust. These individuals broke away from the main minyan. Just about everyone in the community was davening Ma'ariv while it was still full daylight, small number of people broke away from that minyan and formed their own private minyan to daven Ma'ariv Bismano. As we said last time, this is what we ended with last time, this was the first breakaway minyan in Jewish history. Up until this point, every community, whether it was Prague or Baghdad, every Jewish community, everyone within the community had lockstep, identical minhagim, lockstep, identical practices. Now, all of a sudden, beginning in Prague, and it spread out from there all over the Ashkenaz world, indeed all over the world, beginning there, all of a sudden we have two divergent practices in the same city. Most people are davening Ma'ariv while it's still daylight. Some people are waiting until nightfall. Correct. Shema Yisrael, at least the first paragraph, is required as part of Kriyat Shema Alamita. The first paragraph is required, even if one has fulfilled the mitzvah earlier. But if you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah earlier, then you do all three paragraphs to make sure you're doing the mitzvah correctly at night. Is this good or is this bad? Now, I know the answer to the question, as it would have been answered by any rabbi from the earliest rabbinic times until this moment. Any rabbi asked, I'm sure, would have answered, this is horrible, this is really terrible. Breaking away from the main minyan, separating yourself from the main minyan, making a machlokas, making controversy in the community, two different practices. No, horrible, horrible, horrible. What could be worse than that? The Jews must be unified. They must all be doing the same. They must be doing the mitzvahs together in the same way. And I'm sure that would have been the answer to the question. Any rabbi before the 17th century who was asked, hey, Rabbi, I see some people in your community are breaking away from the main minyan and forming their own private minyan to daven Ma'ariv at night. Is that a good idea, Rabbi? No, it's horrible. I'm trying to stop them. I'm trying to convince them to join the main minyan. You're not allowed to separate yourself from the community. You have to be part of the community. Well, now, in the 17th century, for the first time, we see Ashrei Misha Mitchaber Lehem. Oh, anyone who joins these breakaways, anyone who joins these revolutionaries, Ashrei Lo, he is blessed. That's great. Praise, commendation. He thinks very highly of these people because they are mahmir. They are being stricter than everyone else, and that's so praiseworthy. And he totally, completely overlooks the problem. He's not concerned at all with the problem of breaking away from communal practice. Ki chaviva mitzvah b'sha'ata. After all, it's pleasing to God if you fulfill the mitzvah of Kriya Shema at nighttime. These people are doing great things. Makom makom, in any event. Af im lo haya efshar b'chol yemot hashana. If people are unable to do this all year long, in Europe, the further north you go in Europe, the later it gets night in the summer. In summer, sunset is very late in Northern Europe. And, it might be just impractical, it might be impossible for in some communities to follow this strict practice. But at least in the winter, when sunset is earlier, at least in the winter, you can break away from the main minyan and daven Ma'ariv with the individuals who are stricter after night. Anyone whose heart is in the right place, anyone whose heart wants to do the mitzvahs correctly, will join together to these people, b'mei hasfira, surely during Sfira Sa'omer, because then you get also the mitzvah of Sfira Sa'omer at night, which is also better. Well, he's just going from one step to the other. Not only does he have a basic praise, not only is he happy with the collapse of uniformity of practice in the community because these people are being stricter, but not only for Ma'ariv, surely for Sfira Sa'omer also. Ki az mitzvah goreres mitzvah. You do the mitzvah at the right time. The Mishnah teaches us mitzvah goreres mitzvah. The Mishnah teaches us in Pirkei Avos, you do one mitzvah, you'll be led to another mitzvah. It's true that the same Mishnah in Pirkei Avos also teaches us, al tifrosh min hatzibur, do not separate yourself from the main community, but that is willing to overlook in favor of the strict practice. Kriya Shema B'zman Gam Sfiras HaOmer B'tzibur. Well, it's great. It's really wonderful. Not only are you getting Kriya Shema at the best time, you're getting Sfiras HaOmer at the best time. Not only that, you're doing Sfiras HaOmer with the Tzibur. After all, the majority of the community who are davening Ma'ariv before nightfall, when it's still day, at the end of Ma'ariv, just before the people go home, the Gabbai will knock on the table and say, "Gentlemen, don't forget Sfiras HaOmer when you get home. The time for Sfiras HaOmer is not earlier than such and such a time." Well, they're going to be doing Sfiras HaOmer individually at home, and doing a mitzvah together with the congregation is surely better, as it says in Tehillim, Berov Am Hadras HaMelech. If the people get together and do the mitzvah together in the congregation, that's more glory to God. Okay, we see that he loves the idea of separating yourself from the main practice of the community to do something better. And, as I just began to indicate last week, this is simultaneous with the introduction of household clocks. Once we have the introduction of household clocks, they were water clocks. In the 17th century, the first household clocks were water clocks. Drip, 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 drip. The water would drip out. The level of the water would go down. You could see what time it is. Well, it became possible with a clock at home for the people to reassemble in the synagogue for Ma'ariv at night, and during Sfiras HaOmer, they would have Sfiras HaOmer together in the synagogue at night. That's what they were doing. The marketing, clocks existed earlier, but the marketing of the household clock made it possible for the breakaway minyan to separate itself from the main community and be stricter than the main community. And now we have two separate practices in the same town. We never had that before in Jewish history before the 17th century. Before the 17th century, minhag ruled. Everyone followed exactly the same practice in town. Now, before we see more sources, let me outline what this led to. In the course of the 17th century, now that the breakdown of uniformity of practice has begun, now that we no longer have perfect lockstep uniformity of practice in the community, things proceeded from there, and point after point, minhag after minhag, uniformity in practice of the community collapsed. By the end of the 17th century, in every community, different people were doing different things. And the divergence of practice by the end of the 17th century, at least in Europe, was fairly complete. Now, that's one of the principal developments in Jewish practice in the 17th century. 17th century began with everyone practicing the religion exactly the same way, at least within the town. By the end of the 17th century, just about every town had different groups of people doing things their way. That's the 17th century. In the 18th century, in Europe anyway, in the 18th century in Europe, there were two major developments in the Jewish communities. Major development number one in the Jewish communities of Europe was the Hasidic movement. The disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, well, everyone knows who the Hasidim are, and the other major innovation in the Jewish communities beginning in the 18th century was the innovation which came from the Beit Midrash, from the school of thinking of the Gra, the Gaon Vilna. let's for a moment consider the principal characteristics of these two movements. What was new and revolutionary about the thinking of the Gra, the Gaon Vilna, was the idea that correct practice, how do you fulfill the mitzvahs correctly? What is the correct way to do mitzvahs? The answer to that question is study the sources, draw your conclusions from the sources, and follow those conclusions. If that means turning over the apple cart of minhag, so be it. What is correct and incorrect in Torah practice is not controlled by minhag. What is correct and what is incorrect in Jewish practice is controlled by the principal sources, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, and so forth and so on. Now, you have surely heard many times, and I've heard countless times, that you want to know what the halacha is, study the sources, and the halacha flows out of the sources. Master the Mishnah and the Gemara and Rashi and the Tosafot and the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah and so forth and so on. And what flows out of the conclusions which flow out of the sources, that's the correct practice. And if that means overturning the minhag, so be it. Before the 17th century, this position, this idea of the Gra was unthinkable. No one before the 17th century was willing to accept the idea that it's proper, it's correct to change the minhag. No. Minhag is what it's all about. Of course, everyone has to follow the same minhag. The ideology, the method, the thinking of the Gra, which was revolutionary in those days, could not have developed prior to the collapse of uniformity of practice in the 17th century. It's only the end of uniformity of practice in the 17th century, all coming from the household clock, which made it possible for the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, to espouse his thinking, his ideology, learn the sources, and let the cards fall where they may. That fierce independence, following only the truth of the sources, disregarding minhag, that was an essential characteristic of the revolution of the Gra. Let's look for a moment at the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement and the followers of the Gra, they were not in agreement in general. But the revolutionary nature of the Hasidic movement still does depend on groups of Hasidim joining their Rebbe, and that group of Hasidim with their Rebbe have their practices. Well, the idea of gathering around a tzaddik within the town and following his practices as opposed to the time-honored practices of the community, that was unthinkable before the 17th century, because absolute conformity to minhag was the rule which dominated Jewish thinking. By the end of the 17th century, it made perfect sense that individuals could follow divergent practices, and that's what happened. They began to gather around the different tzaddikim, each group following the minhagim of their tzaddik, of their rebbe. The meaning of the word minhag occurs over and over again in Mishnah and Gemara. I mean, I don't mean to say that minhag was only invented later, but prior to the 17th century, minhag within a town was uniform. Different towns, even neighboring towns, had different minhagim, but within the town there was uniform minhag. And this, of course, since you could have neighboring towns with differing minhagim, there had to be some way of defining the exact border between the towns. On this side, you follow the minhagim of that town. On this side, you follow the minhagim of that town. There had to be some way of defining that. And the Shilpei Giborim explains, and this was universally, more or less universal, as far as I know, universally agreed to, it all depends upon Tchum Shabbat. The uniform minhag of the town extends as far as Tchum Shabbat, the distance you are allowed to walk outside of the town on Shabbat. That's the halachic border of the town, and the minhag within that border has to be uniform. Of course, two neighboring towns could have different minhagim. It was very common that two neighboring towns had different minhagim. And of course, the further away you get geographically, the more the differences. That's clear. What have we learned so far? That the two principal developments in Jewish history in the 18th century, the followers of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, and the followers of the Baal Shem Tov, the Hasidic movement, these two movements were enabled, were possible, because of the collapse of uniform practice of the communities, and the collapse at the end of uniform practice of the communities was enabled, became possible only because of the marketing of household clocks in the beginning of the 17th century. Now let's see how these ideas play out in other sources. Here we're going to look at a 19th century source, Noheg Ketzon Yosef. Zman Ma'ariv Sha'a Ravia Kodem Halayla. It should say Kodem Halayla, but I'm a horrible typist. Kodem Halayla. According to the Mishnah, Gemara, and all the sources, they davened Ma'ariv when it was still daylight. Chaynu Dafka B'Shas Hatrak. But the Mishnah, the Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, all of them were talking only about Shas Hatrak when you didn't have a choice, when you were under desperate circumstances and had no other way of doing it. Of course, they never actually mentioned this, but surely they were doing it only because they had no choice. Mitpali Mincha, Ba'asara, they davened Mincha together in the Beit Knesset. The Im Yamtinu, Mitpalel Mariv, if they would have waited until nighttime, Shemalo Yizdam Nuasara, they wouldn't have had a minyan anymore. The people had to get home before it was dark. Even if it's a large community and 30, 40, back in those days, in the Middle Ages, the Jews lived in very small communities. Every little village in France, every little village in Germany, every little village, all over the place, every little village had 1, 2, maybe 3 Jewish families. But they were very small groups all over the place. The total population was fairly large. But in the Middle Ages, the Jews were not yet concentrated in cities. The urbanization of the Jewish people, that happened a little bit later in Europe. And in the Shulchan Aruch, there's still a halacha left over from those days. One halacha left over in the Shulchan Aruch in those days says, if you want to leave your village on Yom Tov, on Yom Tov, you want to go visit your family in another village. If you want to leave your village on Yom Tov because you want to go visit your family somewhere else or for whatever reason, you're not allowed to leave your village unless you find someone else who will come and stand in for you in the minyan. Because if one family leaves the village, there won't be a minyan left in the synagogue. Since they had 1, 2, 3 Jewish families, how many people did they have for a minyan altogether? Well, even in larger communities, where they had maybe 6, 7, 8, 10 families, if they would insist on davening Ma'ariv at night, people wouldn't tolerate it. They'd have to get home before nightfall, and they wouldn't have a minyan. They're not going to come back to the synagogue in the dark for Ma'ariv. Lefichach tov yoter sheyitpalalu b'chadei, it should say, b'chadei mincha, kedei litpalel b'asara. Back in those days, they really had no choice. They had to daven mincha and ma'ariv together, and one does the mitzvah of ma'ariv. The mitzvah is done. Aval mitzvah min amuvchar litpalel ma'ariv seiter kochavim. If you can do it right, you daven ma'ariv at night. And if you have a clock at home, which will tell you what time to reassemble in the synagogue, well, now you really don't have any excuse for davening ma'ariv so early. Of course, you should come to shul. And then he quotes the Shalom Kodesh, which we saw on the previous screen. Not only do the mahmirim, those with stricter practice, get the seal of approval here, but there's not the slightest objection to breaking away from the main minyan. Let's take a look at the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, also 19th century, middle of the 19th century. He says, everyone knows how influential the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch is. Achshav noagim litpalel b'tzibur ma'ariv teichef acha mincha af al pi shadayin eino laila mipnei Torah chatzibur. Still, in the main shul in town, the most of the members of the shul in town, most of the Jews are still davening ma'ariv when it's still daylight. Utorach lesof tzibur sheni. It's hard to gather the people together again for ma'ariv at night. Bilvad shloyei kodem plag mincha ki az afilu b'diavad ein yotzin. The earliest time for ma'ariv is plag mincha. Plag mincha is fairly easily calculated. You divide the interval between sunrise and sunset into 12 equal parts. Each part is a relative hour, and 1 1/4 relative hours. 1 1/4 relative hours before sunset is plag mincha. That's the earliest time for davening ma'ariv. As long as you're after that, you're okay. The ashrei lemisha mitpalel aravit b'tzibur b'layla. But davening ma'ariv at night, breaking away from the minyan, is ashrei, is praiseworthy. Bein mincha l'ma'ariv osek b'Torah. You can study Torah in between mincha and ma'ariv. L'chaber layla im hayom. If you study Torah in between mincha and ma'ariv, you're joining the daytime with the nighttime together by Torah. That's an Inyan Gadol. That's great. That's great if you can do that. Very praiseworthy, even though you've separated yourself from the practice of the community. If you can, daven ma'ariv as soon as you can when it's nighttime, as soon as the stars come out. You shouldn't eat. You should not eat. You should not do anything. Once the proper time for ma'ariv comes, first daven ma'ariv, first discharge your duty in the mitzvah. After having discharged the mitzvah, then you can eat, then you can go about other things. But you should daven first, as soon as the stars appear. You need a clock for that. Study Torah, wait until the right time, and then go for it. If you don't have time for all of this, maybe you have a public shiur you want to attend or give. If you have a shiur you want to attend or perhaps give a shiur, the latest you can daven is midnight. Midnight means halfway between sunset and sunrise. Halfway between sunset and sunrise. How do you know when it's halfway between sunset and sunrise? He's just taught us that's the last time to daven ma'ariv. You should daven ma'ariv before astronomical midnight, halfway between sunset and sunrise. I know when that appears, when that moment occurs, because I have a calendar on the wall where computer program generated, an algorithm generated all the times, and it's printed on my calendar on the wall exactly what time astronomical midnight is. And I have a clock, so I know when astronomical midnight is, and therefore this halacha is something which is practical now that we have household clocks. You should daven ma'ariv before astronomical midnight. B'diavad, if you failed to do that, afilu achar chatzot ad lo ala amud hashachar yotza, as long as you daven even in the second half of the night before it gets light, before light comes, before dawn, you're okay. But the best time is exactly at Seta Kochavim, and well, if you have a good calendar and a clock, you can do that. Now we come to what I think is a largely ignored, but I think very important source. I don't know why this source is not so well known. The book I'm quoting from is well known. The Maaseh Rav is a very well known sefer. The Maaseh Rav is a collection of minhagim and practices of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna. And this book has been reprinted hundreds of times. It's an immensely popular book. Indeed, many sidurim, which follow the prayers, the practices the practices of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, and prayers. Many sidurim have printed in the back. The whole Maaseh Rav, the whole book is around 30 pages long. It's not so long. And it's a very, very well-known book and very influential. But this particular point that we're about to quote from the Sefer is, for some reason, not very well known. Tfilat Arvit Bizmana Dafka Afilu B'Shabbos. You should always daven Ma'ariv when it's nighttime, after the appearance of the stars, even on Shabbat. Many people might want to daven Ma'ariv after night all week long, but on Shabbat they want to get home and have the meal before they put the children to sleep. Even though that's halachically correct, you shouldn't do it. You should daven Ma'ariv at night. Afilu b'yachid, even if that means you won't have a minyan. Now, can you imagine any rabbi prior to the 17th century saying, "Oh yeah, daven Ma'ariv at night, even if you don't have a minyan"? Davening with a minyan was what it was all about until the 17th century. And in the summer, in Northern Europe, in the summer, davening Ma'ariv at night is late, but people do it. Some people do it. The Gra lived in Vilna, which is very far north. If you can't get a minyan together for Ma'ariv, still wait until nighttime and daven at night, even though you will lose the minyan, even though all of the sources up to the 17th century gave full-throated approval to davening Ma'ariv earlier. No. Now we have clocks. Now we do things the best way, even if that means losing a minyan. Now I have one source out of order here. Here we go. Here's an addition to the Tosafot. Here's an addition to the Maaseh Rav. We just quoted the Maaseh Rav, where the Gra taught us never daven Ma'ariv before Tzeta Kochavim, even if that means you're going to miss the minyan. Now, here's an addition, Tosafot, an addition which is printed in the same sefer. And now we come to the point, which I think is very important, but not well known. Here goes. Pamachat, one time, Erich b'Haggadah shel Pesach. Once the Gra took a long time telling Divrei Torah in Leil HaSeder. Leil HaSeder can go on for a long time if you have a lot of Divrei Torah. But according to the halacha, one should eat the afikomen. One should finish the meal with the afikomen before chatzot, before astronomical midnight. Why? Because the afikomen is similar to the korban, and the korban had to be eaten before the korban Pesach had to be eaten before astronomical midnight. So this is not a shiur on how to do the Leil HaSeder correctly, but once it was getting very late. It was getting very late, close to midnight, and the Gra had not yet finished the meal. He was busy, occupied saying Divrei Torah. He beat B'hamoreh Sha'ot, and the Gra looked at his clock. That clock, I suppose it was on the wall. I suppose it was a wall clock. The Gra looked at his clock. V'ra'ah, and he saw Chatzot Me'ameshet Uvah. He saw it's almost midnight. He saw on his clock. Az Teichef Yitzavel Le'echol Afikomen. The Gra said, everyone stop where you are. We're all eating the Afikomen right now because it's almost astronomical midnight, and then we'll continue with Divrei Torah afterwards. The Birkat HaMazon can be afterwards, but now stop whatever you're doing. Everyone eats the Afikomen now before it is midnight. And he's looking at the clock to make sure that everyone eats before midnight. Most of the food which the Rebbitzin had prepared, they didn't get around to eating. I mean, like they made kiddush, they made hamotzi, and they didn't get much beyond hamotzi because he's been saying Divrei Torah, and the Gra said, oh, that's it. This is the end of the meal. Now, afikomen, and all the food the Rebbitzin had prepared is just sitting there on the table. They never got around to eating it. Lo achal shum echad me'am. No one around the table ate anything after the afikomen. Afilu ishto b'nei beito, his wife, the family, no one ate any food after the afikomen, and they were makpid. They were very strict to finish that before chatzot, even though they had not yet really begun the meal. Kiddush they had, hamotzi they had, but that's about it. Now, what makes this source particularly interesting? Oh no, people eat during Divrei Torah. What makes this source particularly interesting in my mind is that the Gra lived in the 18th century, and the finest clocks, the finest mechanical clocks in the 18th century were manufactured in Paris. Paris was the center of clockmaking. The center of clockmaking eventually moved to London, but in the 18th century, the center of clock manufacture was still in Paris. The best clocks were made there. Now, the finest clocks in Paris in the 17th century were accurate to within 10 or 15 minutes a day. By modern standards, that's not so good, is it? But that's what they had. Oh, Atlantic. But that's what they had. The finest clocks in Paris were accurate to within 10 or 15 minutes a day. That was the best clocks in Paris. Now the Gra lived in Vilna, in Lithuania, and I do not know where his clock came from, but assuming that the Gra had the finest clock available in his days, which might well be true, I have no idea, but let's assume that he had the best clock available in his days. When he looked at the clock and said, hey guys, it's almost astronomical midnight according to the clock, let's eat the afikomen before it is midnight, he was talking about a clock that was accurate to within 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. Probably not that accurate, because probably his clock was not one of the finest clocks from Paris. Maybe it was. I really don't know what clock he had, but assuming the best, it was not so precise in modern terms. Now, my wall calendar, which gives me the time of sunrise, the time of sunset, the time of astronomical noon, the time of astronomical midnight, the end of the mitzvah of Kriya Shema in the morning, the end of the mitzvah of davening in the morning, and so forth and so on. I have a very nice wall calendar, which tells me all of these times down to the fraction of a minute. The Gra, who depended on a clock, was depending upon a clock which is not accurate to a fraction of a minute. He was working with a clock that was accurate to a fraction of an hour. And this, I think, is an important source which is often overlooked. Okay, well, what have we learned so far? We've learned that by the 18th century, the timing of mitzvahs, day and night, greatly influenced by the clock. Get back to here. Here we are. Let's go down to the early 20th century. The Mishnah Brura, I hope, needs no introduction. Mishnah Brura, published in the early 20th century. The first volume came out around 1912 or so. Writes as follows: Bismanenu, nowadays, and he wrote this in Eastern Europe, as I said, in the beginning of the 20th century. I don't know exactly where in Eastern Europe he wrote this. He was from the town of Rodin, and I'm in some doubt about exactly where the town of Rodin was, because on his personal stationery, the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim, had a printer who printed up stationery for him, which had his name and address at the top of every page, and that was his paper for writing letters on. And at the top right, he had his name and address in Hebrew, and at the top left, he had his name and address in English. Not Yiddish, not Russian, not Polish, not Lithuanian, in English at the top left of his paper, his stationery, letterhead. On the Hebrew side, his address is given as Radin Lita. He lived in Lithuania. On the English side, his address is given as Radin, Poland. So, where was he? Where was Radin? Was it in Poland, according to his English address, or was it in Lithuania, according to his Hebrew address? Of course, if one looks at the political border on any political map, it's on the Polish side, definitely on the Polish side. But culturally speaking, the Mishnah Brura thought of himself as being Lithuanian, and culturally speaking, he was Lithuanian. After all, cultural adherence does not belong necessarily to political borders. The endless examples of this, where on the other side of the political border, you still have an ethnic majority which belongs to the other country. In Italy, in northern Italy today, in the Tyrol, the people speak German. Culturally, they're part of Austria, but politically, they're on the Italian side of the border. Oh, there are plenty of areas in the world where the political borders do not correspond to the ethnic borders. Ethnically, he considered himself part of Lithuania. He was culturally part of Lithuanian Jewry. Politically, he was on the Polish side of the border. Nowadays, he wrote, back in the beginning of the 20th century, nowadays, most people are doing it kedin. Nowadays, most people are doing it correctly, namely, Kriyat Shema and Ma'ariv at night after the appearance of the stars. Unlike everyone from the beginning of time until the 17th century, they were doing it wrong. Now the majority of people are doing it right, davening Ma'ariv and saying Kriyat Shema after Tzeit Kochavim. Mihu, however, be'ezim mekamot, in some places, b'bate knisiot, in some synagogues, yesh adayin minhag hayashan shemitpalalim teichef acha mincha afshu meba'od yom k'tzat. Some synagogues still have the old practice of mincha and ma'ariv both before sunset. Hamitpalel b'mikomot al elu. If you find yourself in a synagogue like that, Yira lachzor v'lekrot kriyat shema kishiyagia hazman. You just have to repeat the 3 paragraphs of Shema after nightfall. Oh, so we see into the beginning of the 20th century, the old practice still survived here and there. And as many of you might know, in German Jewish communities, in fact, throughout Germany, throughout the Jewish communities in Germany, before the Holocaust, up to the Holocaust, the old practice was still more or less the universal practice. And throughout the German Jewish communities, just about every town was davening Mincha and Ma'ariv together before sunset in the old way. And of course, in the same German Jewish communities up to the Holocaust, uniformity of minhag was still king. That was still the rule of the community. The Hasidic movement had no inroads in Germany up to the period of the Holocaust. The ideology and methodology of the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, made no impact on the German Jewish communities up to the time of the Holocaust. The German Jewish communities were still following the older practices of lockstep uniformity in Jewish practice, and part of that was davening Mincha and Ma'ariv together before sunset. And Mishnah Berurah was aware of this and said, well, at least you have to repeat the 3 paragraphs of Shema after nightfall, which is exactly what they were doing in those German Jewish communities. Now, let's take a look at other elements where the clock comes up in Jewish practice. First, a few quotations from the Shulchan Aruch. Ma she'moreh al sha'ot shekorim relojo. In modern, the author of the Shulchan Aruch was Rabbi Yosef Karo. He came from Spain. He left Spain when he was very young, but he's from the Spanish Jewish community. In modern Spanish, the word for clock is pronounced reloj, but from the spelling R-E-L-O-J, reloj, you can see the older pronunciation in Spanish was reloj, and that's still the word which is used in the Shulchan Aruch. The gadget which tells you the time, namely the reloj, the clock, ben shehu shel chol, ben shehu shel min acher, whether it's a sand clock, where the sand just drips down one grain of sand at a time, and the level of the sand goes down, or something else dripping, doesn't matter what it doesn't matter. Those are basically the 2 kinds of clocks they had, sand clocks and water clocks. Yesh listapek im mutar l'taltalo. I'm not sure whether or not you can carry it on Shabbos, whether or not you can move a clock on Shabbos. Ukvar pashat minhag le'esor. The minhag is to be strict and not permit the moving of a clock on Shabbos. Now, as you know, back in those days, clocks were fairly rare. Many households already had some kind of household clock. That's what he's talking about, a water clock or a sand clock. But the clocks were still very special things, unlike today, where, well, it's no longer true, but in my generation, people used to walk around with clocks on their wrist. And, I'm from my generation, I still do that. I realize that you young people don't bother having wrist watches anymore because you have your telephones with the time on the telephones. You don't need wristwatches anymore. But my point is that nowadays clocks are so common. Either you have it on your wrist or you carry it as part of your smartphone. Since clocks are so common today, I think you're perfectly aware that today the minhag hapashut, the widespread minhag, is to permit transporting these things on Shabbat. As far as as far as transporting them in the public domain is concerned, that's just a little bit of a separate question. He's talking about moving it from one place to another within the house. Is a clock muktzah? Well, he's in doubt, but the minhag is to be strict and consider it to be muktzah. That's the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch. Today, that seems to have changed. Why? Why has it changed? The reason that the minhag has changed on this case is very, very, very easy to understand. Back in those days, a clock was an expensive investment. Not all families had them, not every household had them, but households which were wealthier, which could afford a clock was an expensive thing. And not only was the clock expensive, but it was fragile. And therefore, of course, the clock had its place on this counter, on this shelf, on the wall, wherever the place for the clock was, that was its place. And you don't handle the clock except to fill it up with sand or flip it over when it's time to flip over the sand clock. One doesn't, in general, handle the clock. One does not use the clock for any other purpose. And the rule is that any kli, any utensil which is valuable, any expensive utensil which has a fixed place in your house, a fixed place in your home, and you do not move it for purposes other than using the clock. You would never use the clock as a paperweight. You would never move the clock to use it for any other purpose because it's valuable and fragile. Any such object in the house is muktzah. Machmas chesron kis is muktzah. You're not allowed to handle it on Shabbos because it's valuable. Being valuable is not enough by itself. It needs a fixed place, and you have to not be handling it for any other use. And clocks fell under that categorization back in those days. No, the clocks are so common. Yeah, I have a little clock on my table. Well, the truth is, I do occasionally use it as a paperweight. I really don't care if it's on this side or on that side. I move it around. It doesn't have a specific place where it has to be. I really don't care if it gets used for other purposes. Therefore, the halacha of the clock has changed. Shulchan Aruch also says, Zug hamakashkesh sha'ot, a clock which makes noise every hour. That's a cuckoo clock. Asui al yedei mishkalot. There are weights which control the clock. Once a week, once a month, you have to pick up the weights and put them higher. The weights slowly fall down, giving energy to the clock. That's how the clock works. Once every hour, the clock cuckoos. Mutar le'orcho u'lehachino mib'od yom k'dei sheyelech v'yekashkesh kol Shabbat. It's okay to set the clock in motion before Shabbat, and every hour it will cuckoo on Shabbat. It's okay to have a cuckoo clock on Shabbos, the Shulchan Aruch says. Why is that okay? Well, why not, you might ask. The reason why not is easy enough to understand. The Mishnah, the Gemara, says that on Shabbat there's a prohibition of hashma'at kol. Here we have it typed correctly on chat. Hashma'at kol is making a noise on Shabbat that gives the impression that you are violating Shabbat. Just as mar'it ha'ayin, is a prohibition to do something which gives visual impression that you are violating Shabbat, so hashma'at kol is a prohibition to do anything which gives a sound, makes a sound, and the impression is on the listener that you're doing something in violation of Shabbat. The example of the Gemara is easy enough to understand. If you have a mill which grinds flour, back in those days, The mills were usually on the side of the river, and they used water power on the river to operate the mill. If you fill up the mill with grains of wheat before Shabbat, close the mill and go home for Shabbat, the mill is going to continue grinding on Shabbat, and it's going to make a lot of noise. And the noise, when people hear the noise of the mill grinding on Shabbat, they will think that the miller is in there violating Shabbat. That's a prohibition of Hashma'at Kol. It's a sound which gives the impression that the miller is working on Shabbat. And that you're not allowed to do. You're not even allowed to set up the machinery before Shabbat if that sound is going to be created. Well, what about a cuckoo clock? Since anyone who hears a cuckoo clock knows perfectly well that a cuckoo clock is something which is set in motion once a week, once a month. When you hear the cuckoo clock, you know that it's not something that someone did just now. That's something that someone did long before Shabbat began, and all is well. Now this halacha has very great impact on contemporary practice. I cannot count the number of times that people have asked to me questions of the following pattern, the following kind of question. Are you allowed to use a timer on Shabbat to operate your dishwasher, to operate your television, to operate any kind of electrical apparatus in the house? Well, if the Shabbat clock is going to operate a dishwasher or a television or some apparatus which is going to make a sound, and people who would hear the sound would think that you are violating Shabbat, that's a violation of Hashma'at Kol. And of course, it all depends upon what people would think if they hear the sound of the apparatus which is being operated by the Shabbos timer. In a community where everyone in the community has their automatic dishwasher washing dishes at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning by a timer on Shabbat, and if everyone in the community is doing it, so someone who hears a dishwasher working knows, it was set in motion before Shabbat and all is well. But in a community where it is unusual to use a timer to set a television or a dishwasher or any other noisy apparatus in operation, there, if someone hears the apparatus on Shabbat, they might very well think, someone there is in violation of Shabbat, and that's a rabbinic prohibition of Hashma'at Kol. Now, the single most important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch is the Magen Avram. Of Avram Gambiner was his name. He says, Lo yismoch al kriyat shema al mitatal, even though from the beginning of time until the 17th century, all the authorities were reciting the 3 paragraphs of Shema before nighttime, and then repeating them at night before they went to sleep in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema. Magen Avram says, you shouldn't do that. It's wrong. Chada, the first reason, first reason is, you should first do the mitzvah before eating and drinking. You should first do the mitzvah before you do anything else. Kriyat Shema shel chova tzarich lakrota lechatchil lefnei achila. You should do the mitzvah before you eat. That's the first reason. The second reason, eino mechaven letzedma. Second reason is, if you read the 3 paragraphs of Shema at Ma'ariv before nightfall, and repeat them again at night before going to sleep, you might not have the right kavanah. After all, the rule is mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. The rule is mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. In order to fulfill a mitzvah, you need intention to do so. And people get into the routine of davening Ma'ariv before nightfall and then just saying 3 paragraphs of Shema before going to sleep, they might not realize that they're fulfilling the mitzvah at night. They might not have the proper intention. If you don't have the proper intention, there's no mitzvah at all. Ha'olam nahagu achshav sheyotzim b'kriyat Shema shekaru b'veit knesset af al pi shumu ba'od yom k'tzas. Nowadays, people are davening Ma'ariv and reading Kriya Shema a little bit before night, just a little bit too early. But even if it's just a little bit before the appearance of the stars, it's too early. Remember to repeat Kriya Shema at night and have intention, have in mind that you're doing a mitzvah. In the summer, it's particularly important to remember because in the summer, night is later. If you want to do things the correct way, you do the mitzvah as soon as it is nightfall. It seems to me that someone who made a mistake and began the brachas of Kriya Shema with the tzibur, someone who began davening Ma'ariv while it was still day, by mistake, he joined the community. He joined the community prayers, but then he realizes it's too early. Well, you should finish with them, because if you start making the bracha and stop in the middle, that'll be the use of God's name in vain, and you should complete the bracha. But it's better not to join the community where they're davening Ma'ariv, but to wait until nightfall and do it then. So, there's a lot more could be said about the impact of the clock on halacha, but we've run out of time. With this, we're going to pause, and this concludes this brief series on the influence of the clock. Next Monday evening, I will not be giving a shiur. I'm going to be attending the bar mitzvah of a grandson. But the week after that, 2 weeks from tonight, on Monday, we'll begin a series of shiurim on men and women physically touching each other. Halachas having to do with physical touching between men and women, shaking hands, embracing, and so forth and so on. That'll be beginning 2 weeks from now. Until then, I wish you all well, Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you again when we pick up in 2 weeks. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.